It gives me great pleasure to see all of you here. Some of you I've seen before, some of not. And of course, it gives me, most of all, it gives me pleasure to introduce you to Katarina Jerotic, who is one of my most extraordinary students, who, really has become a geek over this time that we've known each other in the best possible sense. Somebody who came from a background in psychology and now has turned into a complete kind of neuroscience geek, who is tackling one of the hardest problems in neuroscience, namely, what is meaning? How do we get meaning from things like psychedelics and music? And could we even think about, and I want you hopefully to speculate on this, because what you're studying is a group of religious people. Mm-hmm. Why is it that some people find meaning in religion, not just in the psychedelics they take with or the music that are given to them? Why is it really that we have this almost like an innate thing that means that we need to find meaning in things? And of course, for a center of eudaimonia and human flourishing, that's a very deep and very important question. What is it really that happens in our brains when we go into that state that makes it meaningful? And so, with no further ado, I think you're going to take us through a very meaningful set of experiments and thoughts that you've had during the last just over 3 years. And I think you will continue to have those. And I think we'll have some great discussions afterwards. Please, Katarina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And yeah, absolutely, as Morten said, I really hope that the things that I show you today, not just for what they are, but in general, lead to a wider discussion around what is it to have a meaningful experience, whether it's with psychedelics or in music, whether it's a religious experience more broadly, but we can talk about that later. The focus of my research, and I'm a PhD student here at the Center for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing, is psychedelics in music, and specifically characterizing changes in hierarchy of brain dynamics among the sentodimet. Okay, that's like 3 mouthfuls and a lot of different terms. So I am going to, or not, there we go. Start my presentation with a general introduction into why we're looking into psychedelics, why music within the psychedelic experience, the background to the interplay of these two, a little bit about what we mean by brain dynamics and how we're approaching this, as well as the data set that I work with. I'm then going to take you through the 3 main types of analysis that I did throughout my PhD and some of the key findings that are there and what we believe they point to, and then a summary and hopefully a really engaging discussion at the end. So let's start with the introduction. Psychedelics, since the 90s, are experiencing what we think of as a renaissance, a big new boom in research and clinical applicability. Why is this? Well, because classic serotonergic psychedelics, such as LSD, DMT, and psilocybin, commonly termed magic mushrooms, have been found in a variety of studies to show strong potential for being a new tool for improving upon disorders that we've kind of reached a stalemate with. So they've been shown to have strong antidepressant effects, anxiolytic effects, to help people with their symptoms of PTSD, to help individuals long-term with dealing with their addictions. They've also been found to be extremely useful in palliative care, so helping individuals who are facing end-of-life anxiety, which is something that if you ever speak to a clinician who has to tell someone that they have a terminal illness, they'll tell you that this is probably the most valuable thing you can try and help with. But also more generally, outside the clinical setting, psychedelics have been associated with improved outcomes for a lot of positive aspects, such as creativity. So why then music and psychedelics? Well, within our modern Western framework of psychedelic therapy, we know that beyond the effects of the drug itself, 2 key elements are important for long-term outcomes following a psychedelic-assisted therapy session, and these are set and setting. Set refers to the individual's internal state going into the experience, so this is any expectations you might have, the goals that you have, as well as any anxieties that you might have about the experience that you're about to undergo. Setting is everything external to the patient themselves. So this could be your relationship with the therapist or facilitator of the experience. It could be the level of comfort and the warm ambiance of the room that you're in, which is why you can see in the pictures here, often this form of psychedelic therapy is not done in a clinical space. It's done in a comfortable space with warm ambient lighting. The idea is to achieve a sort of living room-like setting, as if you're at home. And of course, music has very often been associated as being a really important element of this external setting. In research that's not directly looking at the effects of music, but where music was involved in the psychedelic therapy experience, it has been shown that positive experiences with the music are associated with enhanced chances of having a mystical experience. So this ineffable, transformative experience that many people have under psychedelics. Also, it's been associated with increased positive emotional valence and enhanced visual imagery, all of which separately on their own have been associated with positive long-term outcomes for a variety of different disorders. The importance of music within the psychedelic therapeutic experience has been so overwhelmingly agreed upon by clinicians that several guides and programs have been developed across the world. And there's just two examples that are well known here of playlists to give based on what you're hoping to achieve with the participant, but also how to vary the music within an individual session. So what you might play to someone in the initial stages of the experience when they're first starting to get some of these hallucinogenic effects might be very different to what you give them at the very peak of the experience or post. However, it's very important to acknowledge that this idea of using music and psychedelics for healing is not something that is new. It's not something that we invented with Western psychedelic therapy. It has been used across cultures for hundreds and thousands of years. And here are just some examples. So the Native Americans use peyote in their healing ceremonies. So here you'll have the entire group collectively together. You'll have one person kind of leading the song and everyone else responding to it iteratively. So there's this group making of music that's involved in the psychedelic experience. Mazatec Indians use psilocybin mushrooms during their shamanic rituals. Often this will be just the shaman who produces the music and everyone else sits in silence. So the shaman is the guide here. The Bwiti tribe of Gabon have initiation ceremonies that every member of the tribe will go through. And here they take ibogaine, and the whole group collectively takes part in drumming and chanting that intensifies throughout the experience, creating music. And of course, you have the use of ayahuasca in Amazonian shamanism, where again, much like with Mazatec Indians, it will be the shaman who's leading the musical experience. The use of music and psychedelics moved from these ritualistic smaller group settings to more populous regions, cities, and so on through the development of syncretic churches. This is especially in Latin America and Brazil. So these are churches that incorporate modern monotheistic religions with local rituals and beliefs that were there beforehand. Most of these use ayahuasca, the psychedelic brew. So there's the Santo Daime, who I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment because they're the focus of my research, but also the União de Vegetal and Barquina as well. Right, so the Santo Daime, who I am very interested in, let me tell you why. So the Santo Daime is one of these syncretic churches. They're primarily Catholic, but they incorporate elements of Afro-Brazilian beliefs and Amazonian shamanism into their practice. What does this technically day-to-day mean? It means that during their religious ceremonies, which are quite regular, they happen several times a month, they will ingest ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a psychedelic brew that they use as a way of feeling closer to God and seeing into the eye of God. It's commonly made of two main plants, the Psychotria viridis and the Banisteriopsis caapi. The first of these contains the main psychoactive component DMT, and the second contains the monoamine oxidase inhibitors or beta carbolines that make sure that the DMT doesn't just get digested in our gut, but rather it enters the bloodstream and crosses the blood-brain barrier. Even one-off use of ayahuasca outside of a religious setting when given to depressed individuals has been associated with significant and long-term antidepressant, anxiolytic, and de-stressing qualities. But in this group in particular, it's taken often and regularly. So the people that we work with, often they'll be members of the church for over 10 years, in which they're taking ayahuasca several times a month. So quite a niche sample. But the other reason that I'm really excited about them specifically is because the Santo Daime have a musical doctrine. So the music that they produce and listen to, they deem to be highly meaningful, to the point that they believe it was given to them by God rather than being made by members of the church. And so I just very briefly, before I get into the technicalities of our data collection and the analyses that I look at and how I approach the brain, I want to give you a little bit of an insight into what a Santo Daime ceremony commonly looks like. So this is an ayahuasca ceremony, and you'll see that everyone is involved in the production of the music. So just a little snippet into what it looks like. These ceremonies would last hours otherwise. So the data set that I work with was a beautiful collaborative effort between the Center for the Psychopharmacology Lab at the University of Maastricht, the Center for Music in the Brain at Aarhus University in Denmark, and the Center for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing here at Oxford. So we had 24 members of the Santo Daime Church, well, their Netherlands branch, who took part in 2 days of data collection. On the first, they didn't take any ayahuasca, and we scanned them the way we would any other person. But on the second day, they took part in their usual ayahuasca ceremony, with the moment at which each participant took the ayahuasca being spaced by an hour and a half to allow everyone to be scanned at the peak of their psychedelic experience. So we had structural MRI taken, magnetic resonance spectroscopy, resting state fMRI, and a music task fMRI. On the second day, when they consumed ayahuasca, we also took blood samples, and on both days, they completed a battery of cognitive tests and questionnaires. So my research is looking at changes in brain dynamics, both at rest and during the music task. So my focus is on the resting state fMRI and the music task fMRI. Now, I talk about changes in brain dynamics and brain activity. What do I mean by this? Well, we can think of brain activity as being organized in a functional hierarchy, such that at the bottom of the hierarchy, we have primary sensory regions, such as the primary visual and auditory cortices, that are just responsible for bringing new information into the system. And at the top of the hierarchy, we have regions responsible for large-scale integration of information and then the broadcasting of that information back to the rest of the brain. We can think of this through the predictive coding theory, which stipulates that we are not just passive observers to our environment. We're not just continuously taking in all the information around us, which makes sense just based on the fact of how much information there is. But rather through our experiences and through learning in life, we build models of what we expect to commonly see around us. And these models generate predictions. This is why visual illusions, for example, work. They play with some of the predictions that we have. And so we have a prediction coming down and we have new information from the senses coming in. And when these two meet, there's a prediction error. And this prediction error is fed back up to the model to improve upon the model, to tell us, okay, well, we thought we were going to see this. We didn't quite see it. How can we improve what we expect to see for next time? And this idea of predictive coding has also been used to explain music perception. This idea that we are not just passively ingesting musical stimuli, but rather that we have a prediction about what it is that we are going to hear based on our own auditory competencies, based on culture, based on the general context, our familiarity with the piece that's coming in. And so I think the easiest way to think of this is we have an internal meter of the rhythm that we expect to hear, and then a musical piece will break that rhythm. And we might feel the need to reinforce the rhythm by tapping our foot or clicking our fingers or something like that. Now, the same functional hierarchy that explains how we perceive the world around us is thought to be dramatically affected under the influence of psychedelics. So the rebus, or relaxed beliefs under psychedelics model, developed by Professor Robin Carhart Harris and colleagues, basically stipulates that under the influence of psychedelics, we experience a flattening of this hierarchy. So models that used to have a huge influence on how we interpreted the world around us are now more equally weighted to the new sensory information coming in. And this allows for a greater free flow of information, greater entropy, and therefore more learning. And it's thought to be why psychedelics seem to show potential for a variety of different disorders. Now, there is some research on the interplay of psychedelics and music. I have a few examples here just to show that for the most part, they're focused on one direction. So how does being under the influence of a psychedelic affect your perception or your response to a musical stimuli? So how does being under the influence of LSD affect your neural response to the auditory oddball paradigm or mismatch negativity paradigms? As well as your neural response to more complex stimuli, such as dynamic changes in music, but very much this idea of how does the psychedelic affect the perception of music. There has been one really beautiful study by Professor Pedro Mediano and colleagues that looked at more large-scale brain changes with and without the inclusion of musical stimuli, but also with and without the inclusion of visual stimuli, and looking at how this affects entropy changes following LSD ingestion. So when you're just lying there with your eyes closed, no stimuli, they show that you have the greatest increase in entropy compared to placebo. That this effect is slightly diminished when you have your eyes still closed, but you're listening to music. That the effect is even further diminished when you open your eyes, and even more so when you're watching a silent movie. So this is kind of the first paper that at least I am aware of that properly tries to look at large-scale neural dynamic changes with and without music within the psychedelic experience. However, I think that this is a space that we need to delve into more deeply, and the reasoning for this comes from anthropology. So many anthropologists have spent decades in places like the Amazon looking at the impact of music within these psychedelic experiences. And for example, Shannon showed that rhythm can directly affect the passage of time. So you have this idea of music very directly affecting the psychedelic experience. They even had one moment where they noted that the instruments involved in the music, this was a musician speaking who was under, I believe he had taken ayahuasca, that the instruments that were involved affected what he hallucinated. So the actual manifestations themselves. This idea of music being a guide specifically within the psychedelic experience has been often repeated throughout the anthropological research literature. And so much so that after decades of research in the Peruvian rainforests, seminal anthropologist Dopkin Derwa and Katz developed the jungle gym of consciousness theory. And what this says is that in this more chaotic, entropic state that is a psychedelic experience, music provides routes, avenues, collections of monkey bars that you can use to get through the experience. This also aligns with the fact that in most ritual settings, music is used to guide the ceremony. So the shaman or the facilitator will choose specific types of music in order to achieve the goals that the participant may want to achieve. It's also important to note that music has been associated with altered states of consciousness in the absence of any drug intervention. So entering trance or groove-like states, but also in religious settings, people getting into, for example, speaking in tongues, those types of trance states as well. And just to drive this point home, I'd really like to read you this quote that I love by the anthropologist Labat, who says, "Music activates deep emotions, produces religious ecstasy, and permits spiritual transcendence, tears down and rebuilds notions of time and space, creating the experience of a self-evident, intangible truth." So there really seems to be something more significant happening than simply your perception of music is altered when you're under the influence of psychedelics. So there's a lot to be done in this space, but the gap that my work specifically is looking to fill is that there is a limited understanding of the effects of incorporating music into the psychedelic experience on whole brain dynamics, and specifically the functional hierarchy, and even more so how these things are affected by manipulation of the musical stimuli themselves. So how different components of the music might affect this. So I'm going to go into the first little bit of analysis. So I've kind of cherry-picked things that seem would probably be the most interesting to you here. So first, I looked at overall large-scale brain dynamic changes following just the ingestion of ayahuasca. So we're not looking at music specifically yet. And for this, I opted to using the functional harmonic framework that was developed by Dr. Selene Atasoy, Dr. Katarina Blom, and later this method of harmonic decomposition in space-time specifically was developed by Dr. Jakub Wachrzyk over here on the top right. So the idea is that they took the dense functional connectome from the Human Connectome Project. So this is averaged across over 800 participants, really high quality data. And they ran eigendecomposition of the graph Laplacian, which is commonly used in neuroscience, basically creating 11 functional bases or 11 frequency-based spatial maps. Creating an alphabet of brain states that we can use to interpret different brain activity with. Why did I choose to use these? Well, because in the original work by Katharina Glum, they compared this to other functional bases, such as principal component, ICA, and so on, and found them to be as accurate, if not more so, in aligning with well-established understandings of how the brain parcellates, distinctions between regions. So beyond this, it's also very exciting that the first 11 functional harmonics were able to effectively reconstruct the data, not from the Human Connectome Project, not just in the resting state, but across 7 different tasks, and was later found to effectively reconstruct the data in a separate sample of participants who were given DMT. The final point on this method itself here is that, as you can see here in the right-hand side, the functional harmonics map onto spatial maps that we already know well in neuroscience. So for example, functional harmonics 4 and 8, that's not represented here, but they outline 2 different forms of retinotopy. Functional harmonics 11 and 3 create a complete somatotopy of the body, so from right to left hand and from top of the head to bottom of the feet. Functional harmonic 9 outlines the default mode network, and this is a particularly important one for psychedelic research, as the default mode network has time and time again shown to be significantly affected under the influence of psychedelics. And also what I'm interested in is functional harmonic 2, which shows this separation gradient between unimodal and multimodal brain regions, which quite well maps onto this idea of the functional hierarchy. And this, of course, was reflected by the seminal work of Mesulam and later Mirgalis and so on. And so now that we have this alphabet of brain states. What do we do with it? Well, there are a lot of different measures that we can extract from it, but I'm just going to talk to you about two today. One is absolute power. So this is the average overall contribution of each functional harmonic across time. So for each volume of our brain activity, how well does it correlate to that functional harmonic? How well does that functional harmonic outline the activity that we see? And we do that for each volume across our time series. Relative power, on the other hand, is similar, but it's the redistribution of this absolute power relative to the other functional harmonics. And so the other reason that I decided to go in this direction is because my colleague, Elisa Serra, who is in the room now, did a really beautiful piece of work for her master's thesis, where she compared these measures of functional harmonics and harmonic decomposition across three different independent psychedelic data sets. So here, the yellow lines are placebo, and then we have dark blue is DMT, light is LSD, and this medium color is psilocybin. And what I want to point out to you specifically here is when you look at absolute power, and significance is denoted by the red stars on top, you can see that across majority of the functional harmonics, you see a significant reduction in power compared to placebo for all of the psychedelics. Even those that don't reach significance still show a trend towards a reduction. And so because we saw this across all of the psychedelics, we were thinking of this as a potential signature of the psychedelic state through the lens of functional harmonics. When it comes to relative power, it's a bit more varied. So here we were looking at it more from an exploratory perspective of what will we see with the ayahuasca data set. So for my research, I wanted to compare the DMT dataset that Elisa worked with my ayahuasca dataset. This being because, as I mentioned, DMT is the main psychoactive component of ayahuasca. Now, in my case, I chose to compare the pre and post DMT injection scans to my dataset, as I don't have a placebo within the ayahuasca condition. So this felt like a more direct comparison. And so what do we find? Well, in absolute power, and I'll just walk you through the chart a little because there's a lot going on there. The top row is the DMT data. The bottom row in blue is the ayahuasca data. And underneath, you can see each of the functional harmonics that the column corresponds to. Lighter colors mean no drug. Darker colors mean drug present in the scan. And what we see with the DMT, large scale across the functional harmonics, we see the significant reduction in absolute power, which is exactly what we expect to see from the work that's been done previously. Excitingly, it's what we see for the most part with ayahuasca as well, showing that we do see the same psychedelic signature as we see in the other drugs. The reason that this is exciting is because with ayahuasca, and especially with this data set, the participants take a lower dose, ending up with a lower dose of DMT than they would in a clinical trial where intravenous DMT is given. So we wanted to make sure that we're seeing these large-scale brain changes that we expect. And of course, it's great that we see them in functional harmonic 2, where the default mode network is outlined, and in functional harmonic 9, where we have this separation between unimodal and multimodal. That was most interesting to me. When it comes to relative power, we do see significant reductions in the DMT data set, specifically in functional harmonics 2 and 9, but we don't see this with the ayahuasca, which points to the fact that we need to more directly explore this idea of a functional hierarchy. There seem to be similar effects, but they're not necessarily exactly the same. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next part. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask about the two data sets? So
yeah.
The DMT data set is both a larger dose and it's not repeat use?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Exactly. The Santo Daime is quite a niche sample in that sense, but this felt like the closest potential comparison. Yeah, absolutely. So in the next section, we just focus on the ayahuasca data set with the Santo Daime, and we look at specifically changes in functional hierarchy following ayahuasca ingestion and music listening here. So we'll get to that part. So we use some of our lab's whole brain modeling techniques where we apply thermodynamic-based measures of non-reversibility. In essence, through all of this, we get a causal understanding of which regions are driving the activity of others. So what is the directionality of information flow? And this is really important because then we use a concept that originated from ecology and got moved into neuroscience, specifically looking at this directionality of information flow and how it suggests a hierarchy to extract two measures: directedness and trophic levels. Directedness, all you need to know is the higher the directedness, the steeper the hierarchy. There is a clear understanding of information flow, more so in one direction than the other. Lower directedness means that it's not that clear cut. There's a more flattened hierarchy happening. Trophic levels gives you an understanding of where each node sits within this system. What sits towards the top of the hierarchy, what's more towards the middle, and what sits at the bottom. And so what do we find? Well, when we take this overall measure of directedness, or how hierarchical the system is as a whole, first, we do see what we expect to see, which is namely that when we compare resting state, no ayahuasca, and resting state ayahuasca, we see a significant reduction in overall directedness or hierarchy following the ingestion of ayahuasca. Within the music paradigm, we observe the same. No ayahuasca has a higher directedness than ayahuasca. And importantly, we do not see a significant reduction when you just include music. So when no drugs have been involved, but you're either resting and then you're comparing it to listening to music, because we wouldn't expect to see such large-scale brain changes that you see from a psychedelic with the inclusion of a musical stimulus. It is important to note that the resting state conditions were collected with eyes open, looking at a fixation, and the music conditions were collected with eyes closed. That was the instruction. Usually this wouldn't be a problem, but within the psychedelic literature, having your eyes open or closed drastically affects the psychedelic experience. So for the purposes of these analyses, these are the main comparisons that we can make and know why the differences are happening. So in both the resting state condition and separately in the music conditions, the addition of ayahuasca leads to a flattening of the hierarchy, which is good. This is what we expect. We then wanted to bring this down to the mesoscopic level, looking at resting state networks. Specifically, we looked at the 7 resting state networks that are commonly used that were developed by you in 2011. So these are the visual, somato-motor, dorsal attention, ventral attention, limbic, frontoparietal, and of course, the default mode network. And we included a subcortical network as well. So all of the subcortical regions that weren't included in these were put into one network. And so we compared average trophic levels, again, within the resting state conditions, so no ayahuasca versus having had ayahuasca. And we see significant reductions in the dorsal attention, limbic, and importantly, the default mode network. And when we look at the music conditions, we again observe the same significant reduction in dorsal attention, limbic, and default, but also significant reductions in the frontoparietal and the ventral attention networks. And this is interesting because these correspond to the executive control and salience networks that are commonly discussed as being affected both within themselves, but also with their interaction with the default mode network under the influence of psychedelics. So we're expecting to see, what we see is what we expect to see, essentially. We then brought this down to a single node level and we said, okay, so we have a support vector machine learning classifier and we give it information about a subject. So we just feed it information about the organization of the nodes within the hierarchy. And we do this for all the subjects and we say, how well can the machine learning classifier tell whether the data it was given came from a participant who had taken ayahuasca or in the scan where they hadn't taken ayahuasca. And turns out it can do it very, very well. It achieves over 88% accuracy in distinguishing between the drug and no drug condition, just based off of information on where nodes sit in the hierarchy. And this is great because it points to an idea that there is a significant and consistent reorganization of the hierarchy between the two. When we look at music over on this side, so over here, and we use all 80 regions because we use a parcellation of 80. So these are all of our regions. Again, you achieve a high accuracy of 78, almost 78%. It's important to note that with the music condition, it seems that you actually achieve the highest accuracy with just a subset of 10 regions. So just by knowing where these regions have moved in the hierarchy, you can effectively distinguish between the two conditions. And using the top 10 regions within the resting state condition, you achieve high accuracy as well. Not the highest, but still significantly high. What's interesting though, the top 10 regions for rest and the top 10 regions for music don't have a lot of overlap. So there, even though we're again seeing a reconstruction of the hierarchy, it's not necessarily happening in the exact same way. Yeah.
I was just wondering whether you did music, no music, drug-free, and whether that looked similar to the music with ayahuasca, and whether like ayahuasca was accentuating the effect that you get from the music, because you get an activation of the auditory cortex and those kind of regions, and whether it's kind of just driving activity more.
Yeah, so we did that for the overall directedness levels, and we did find that if you just added music, there wasn't a significant difference between the two. I don't think there was a difference with the resting state networks. I'd have to look back at it though.
This is fMRI, so you've got ding, 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 ding happening all the time.
True.
So unlike the MEG studies that she presented first, you have that concept.
Yeah, you do, exactly.
Auditory, no auditory doesn't really work in this concept.
Okay,
A good question. So far I've been talking to you about it's either rest or they're listening to music. But when they're listening to music, they're not just listening to a continuous stream of music. Actually, it was a music listening task in that it had a 2x2 design. So they were played 4 different types of music that varied in familiarity and predictability. So what do I mean by familiarity? If a song was familiar, it was part of their corpus. They knew the lyrics, they were familiar with the songs. If it was unfamiliar, it was designed to have the same feel and tonality as their music, but it was fabricated. So they'd never heard it before. When it comes to predictability, predictable means it is as it is, nothing was changed. Unpredictable means that the onset of melodies and rhythms was randomly and slightly shifted, such that you couldn't really predict what note was coming next and exactly when the beat would land. So this linking back to the predictive coding of music theory and seeing how that's affected. And again, we looked at this measure of overall directedness, thinking, okay, well, you see a reduction following ingestion of ayahuasca with music. You'll probably see it across most of them. Didn't happen. You actually only see a significant reduction in directedness in one of the conditions. And interestingly, it's the familiar unpredictable condition. So it's their music, but their music that's been slightly manipulated. We then just wanted to check, is this because maybe the baseline, the no drug condition, was significantly different between them? Maybe the musical stimulus had some effect there, but there was no significant difference between the baselines, suggesting that this in fact is a drug effect. And even more so, because we see the significant reduction at rest when there's no music, we can hypothesize that actually, for example, with the unfamiliar music, where we don't see a significant difference, this could in some way be an inhibitory effect of the musical stimulus. We then again brought this down to the resting state network level and very clearly showed us that whole brain measure was accurate at this level too. So no significant differences across any of the music conditions except the familiar unpredictable, where again you see large scale changes in average trophic level across the resting state networks. And when we look at a node level, so again, we're using the support vector machine classifier. As we expect with a familiar unpredictable that was significantly different, with high accuracy, we're able to distinguish between drug and no drug. We expect to see that that's great. But actually in the familiar predictable condition where we didn't see a significant lowering or change either at the whole brain or contained to the well-known resting state networks, the machine classifier is still able to, with extremely high accuracy, 95% here, distinguish between whether someone had taken the drug or not taken the drug simply based on the location of nodes within the hierarchy, suggesting that although it might not be a flattening, there does seem to be some sort of reorganization that's happening. Okay, so there we kind of tackled the heavy whole brain modeling and specifically looking at the functional hierarchy. Okay. The next and final part that we wanted to look at was, how does all of this relate to experience, to cognition? At the end of the day, a psychedelic experience is a profound experience to the participant often, and if nothing else, can be a really weird experience. So how is this reflected in the data? So the first thing that we did, and actually Professor Ramekers, who spearheaded the data collection at the University of Maastricht, published a paper in 2023 where he looked at a subset of the questionnaires, finding that if we take the blood sample, so DMT levels, these are significantly correlated with several measures related to the psychedelic experience, including oceanic boundlessness. So this is this feeling of complete oneness. Then the other one was visionary restructuralization. So how your visual field is affected by the psychedelic, what you see that might not be there. And of course, the ego dissolution inventory score. So this is how much you felt like you lost your ego in this experience. So for this data set, we looked at all the measures. So just to see what's happening. So we have the ego dissolution inventory down here that has a significant positive correlation with the drug. But we also took from the 5DIC, so the 5 dimensions of the altered states of consciousness questionnaire, which is commonly used in psychedelics. We see a significant positive effect with correlation with oceanic boundlessness and visionary restructuralization, as was reported before. But also we looked at the 11 dimensions of the altered states of consciousness questionnaire because we had them, so why not really see what's happening? And again, we see a few really exciting things relating to blissful state, complex imagery, yeah. And then,
sorry.
Yes.
So you measured this with a post-experience questionnaire?
Yes.
Okay.
So these are just looking at the effect of the drug.
Yeah.
This doesn't go into the different contexts. So this is using all 24 members. When we look at the music task, we actually had to remove 3 members because they weren't able to complete the music task. So we just ran it again with the 21 members. And of course, with a drop in power, because this with psychedelics, they're usually small samples anyway, a lot of the significance went away. The only one that maintained from the original results is changes in meaning and percepts. But the one that's quite interesting to me that only appeared when we looked at people who had experienced the musical task as well is impaired control and cognition. And so we were thinking. And Dr. Andrea Lupi, who's a postdoc and a Wellcome Trust Fellow here at the Center for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing, developed this beautiful technique called cognitive matching. So are people familiar with the Neurosynth database? Okay, I'll explain it anyway. The Neurosynth database is a meta-analytic tool. It basically takes information from tens of thousands of papers from across scientific journals and looks at associations between specific terms and specific brain regions. And based on that, creates spatial maps that are generally associated with those terms. And so what Dr. Lupi did was extract in a data-driven way 123 terms that are well associated with cognition, which is what we're interested in here. And what we do is we spatially correlate the maps associated with those terms with every volume in our brain activity. And this creates maps by volumes matrix for each person, correlation matrix. in Dr. Lupi's work, originally, he looked at this idea of quality of cognitive matching. So how well does the brain activity overall match with any of these brain maps that are commonly related to cognition? And what he found in his work, it was looking at different levels of anesthesia, was that as people go further and further under anesthesia, their quality of cognitive matching goes down, which makes sense. It's intuitively what we would expect to see. So for my research, I wanted to see in the 4 main conditions of my research, does the drug, does the context, does something affect the quality of this cognitive matching? And it does. The context does. Now, on the one hand, someone might say, how come the drug that leads you into a completely different state isn't affecting this? But I think it might just be based on the types of terms that we're looking at here. So we're not looking at phenomenology per se, we're specifically looking at cognition. And so in this overall measure, we see a main effect of context such that there's greater quality of cognitive matching when people are resting than when they're listening to music. And when we think about the fact that neurosynth is a meta-analytic tool from across the neuroscientific literature, much of our research is done in the resting state. So that also makes sense, but it's interesting to have this idea of context. What's important here is, as I mentioned, this is averaged across 123 spatial maps that all target very different elements of cognition. So then we wanted to break it down and say, okay, if we just look at the individual maps, what's happening? And so we ran repeated measures ANOVAs looking at the main effects of drug, context, and the interaction of the two on our conditions. And we found no main effects of drug, no interaction effects, but many effects of context for individual brain maps. And here I am just showing you the ones that were still significant following multiple comparison correction for the 123 comparisons. So they were very significant. And I think the results are interesting because, as you can see, you have terms like fixation and gaze that might relate to this idea of eyes open versus eyes closed. But you also have frameworks such as mental imagery and object recognition. And what's most interesting to me is you have a lot of language comprehension, sentence comprehension, word recognition, rehearsal, reading, a lot of language-focused terms. And so before we drew any conclusions from this, we wanted to look at the directionality of these significant differences. So, for example, you have fixation up here in the top right corner, and the next one down there is gaze. And we see what we expect to see here. There's a higher association in the resting state conditions when people had their eyes open with fixation and gaze than in the music condition when they had their eyes closed. In the same way, for example, all of the terms related to language comprehension, reading, meaning, learning, rehearsal, sentence comprehension, word recognition, they all consistently have a higher association in the music condition than they do at rest. And I believe that this is because they're listening to music that they know. They're searching for the lyrics that bring them closer to their experience that they usually have. So that has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the main findings that I've had over the last few years. And I'm just going to end it with a quick summary to show you how it all links together. So I started my PhD with a narrative review looking at the existing literature on the interplay of music and psychedelics from a psychological, clinical, neuroscientific, anthropological perspective. We then looked at these broader large-scale brain dynamics just to see that we're seeing what we expect to see. And we found some interesting results there. We then more specifically looked at the functional hierarchy and observed the flattening of this hierarchy as we expected. However, interestingly, within the music condition, it wasn't as simple as just any music leads to this flattening, but it also wasn't as simple as you just play them their music, that's what they love, they don't care about anything else. There seems to be something of a sweet spot happening there, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more after. Finally, we related all of this to cognition and phenomenology to try and see, can we actually interpret parts of their experience directly from the brain activity? Again, finding some interesting results, and all of this with the objective of understanding changes in large-scale brain dynamics following ayahuasca ingestion and music listening in the Santo Daime, which is just a little step towards better understanding how we can use music as a fruitful tool in psychedelic therapy more broadly. Thank you so much for listening. And this is the wonderful team here at the lab, some of who I know are not included in these pictures, but we are yet to take a proper group photo and make sure everyone is there. And thank you to all the collaborators, and thank you to you guys.
What a journey. Maybe I can use my my prerogative.
Absolutely, prerogative away.
What about that sense of meaningfulness, the eye of God that they report? I would like to speculate. What is going on here? Is it something about the drugs? Is it something else? What is this state that you go into when you feel truly flourishing with the help of drugs in this case, with the help of music, with the help of other people? What is it about feeling that you have this oneness? Are you willing to speculate on this? You certainly should in your final thesis.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
why don't you?
I think, yeah, of course, like religion will play a huge part in this. They're a very specific community. But I think it's kind of similar to what a lot of meditators who have taken psychedelics say. That idea of, oh, having this psychedelic experience kind of gave me a gateway into a moment in my meditation that I hadn't reached yet. And ever since then, they've just progressed so much in their own meditation with and without the drug. And so maybe this could be similar.
Meditators usually acknowledge that whatever they are reaching is something within themselves. A lot of religious people, especially say within the Christian tradition, insist that there's something else out there. How does this work? How is, I mean, again, I'm pressing you a bit here because I think these are really interesting questions. Are we opening ourselves up to the universe, or are the universe inside of us? What's your thinking on this?
Well, I would say, why does it have to be either or? Both can be true, and I think both are just a interpretation of something that feels so much bigger and beyond our daily perception.
Just playing the devil's advocate, how can they both be true? I mean, is it an either or? I mean, how, if there is something outside of us, is it so that through these experiences that we become something, a recipient of something outside of us, or is that inside of us always there? Because of course, it also begs the question, and now we're getting really into the weeds here, but of course it begs the question, which again, within the Christian tradition, is this idea of the afterlife, right?
Yes, but I think it's also within the Christian tradition for many people to say that they feel like God is in everything, in all of us, that we are him and he is us. Or she, of course. So to me, this would be more of an interpretation effect of something that's just so, that feels very profound and inexplainable.
And so just to, again, not to put you in a
No,
spot, but I think
of course.
these are important questions. So what kind of experiment would you design to really test the religious experience? I mean, here we have a bunch of really religious people that claim, and this of course is the claim they make. They say, I participate in these things because I want to see the eye of God. Now, we also have them in a placebo state. We have them in a state where they are not actually using all these gateway drugs to get into that state. If you had the power, what kind of experiment would you design? Would you have people with real kind of meaningful religious experiences with or without, say, drug? I mean, what would you do?
Well, I wonder how you would ensure that someone has a meaningful religious experience in a scanner.
But it's probably not that different from somebody saying that they're deeply meditating. Because
well,
of course,
so this is what I would do. I would have probably 3 data sets. One meaningful experience with religion, one meaningful experience with meditation, and maybe one with psychedelics as well, and see if there's something
common to them.
Common, yeah, because and maybe with psychedelics, it might be a step out, but I think especially with meditation and religion, where it's kind of self-produced, there must be
And
something.
a common denominator here really is the meaningfulness of that
Yeah.
experience, right?
Yeah.
And so, of course, this is what we're after in the center. So you come to the right place, but it's not my job to do this. Please, there must be many questions.
Maybe it relates to insight.
Yes, absolutely. Anybody? Don't feel shy.
Yeah, it seems like, from my own experience, just meditating, my experience of out of body experience meditating without music, and that out of body experience made me feel very free and unencumbered by the stuff I feel oppressed and encumbered by in general life. And what you were saying about the ayahuasca experience with music seems to indicate that people experience that freedom of ego.
Yeah.
And that is how I experienced that in my own without ayahuasca experience. I wonder if anybody else or anyone you come across who just simply meditates has described that feeling of being free of ego, which is this absolutely wonderful feeling.
Yeah.
And people who supposedly die, you know, their heart stops beating and so on, who have come back, talk about that same sense of freedom and not wanting to come back. So I wonder if there's any correlation between the
I think
ayahuasca and music and the freeing up of your, you know, leaving behind your ego.
I think definitely the things that people talk about, there's a lot of overlap. And yes, I've absolutely heard other people, especially who've been long-term meditators, discuss exactly what you're talking about, this idea of losing their sense of self, but then often it'll progress to things like not just losing a sense of self, but genuinely feeling like the periphery of themselves does not exist, just a complete oneness with everything else. And people under high doses of psychedelics have reported these types of experiences as well. I wouldn't know exactly how to answer why, but I think there is a perspective shift in having something so profound happen to you that maybe the daily ways of thinking that we usually get caught up in, almost you have like a jolt in the system that's like, why am I doing that? Maybe something more along those lines.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you think in your experience, I don't know whether you come across this, but do people who regularly take ayahuasca in a religious context, do they report being able to be more effective in their lives in general? Or have you not studied
So
this?
there has been some research on this. There's research showing that there's lower rates of depression, anxiety, things like that among, for example, the Santo Daime. However, it's very difficult to know the causal implications of that. So is that because of the regular psychedelic effects? Is it because of the religious component? Is it because it's quite a tightly knit, smaller community? So people feel embraced by this group of people that's like, it's okay, we're in this with you, we're together. But there is an association for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
We have two questions online as well.
Okay.
Jan Farkas, do you want to speak to it? Can you hear us?
Yes, yes, I can. The question is if you can hear me and if you can hear me clearly. Perfect. First of all, thank you, Kate. It was a very enriching talk, and also the format or the form that you chose. And as you spoke, it was the very broad, very much brought a sense of clarity. So I really appreciate that. I don't see that much in the scientific talks at all.
Thank you.
To introduce myself, I'm speaking from Czech Republic. I'm a fellow neuroscientist. I don't focus on psychedelics, but I'm a member of Czech Psychedelic Society, and it's yeah, the 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 concept and the topic has been an interest of mine for more than 10 years. So my question, I mean, I have a lot of questions, but the one that really um, touches the methodology and the research that you did, which I find quite impressive and brilliant, is really about the neuroscientific analysis that you did, and it concerns the design. And my question is, why did you choose to have the resting state data with the eyes open, with the focused gaze, and music with eyes closed? Because there are other sub questions occurring, and the thing is that we have a bunch of data and the analyses uh, of resting state data mainly in with eyes closed. So I think it would be more appropriate to compare eyes closed and eyes closed with music, uh, and that would be shed much more light into the comparison itself. Uh, but I would like to hear your opinion and what do you think about it, and if there's a a way forward in the pursuit.
No, yeah, absolutely. Very good point. I think you're completely right. I think the original plan, I believe, was to have either everyone with eyes open or eyes closed. But as you know, organizing data collection, doing all of these things, there's a lot of different people involved. And sometimes something that's like a small change somewhere leads to something that's a little different than the original protocol. So I completely agree. It would be very meaningful to have a data set where everyone has their eyes open or their eyes closed. Probably for the most part, I heard someone say this recently, that it's usually physicians involved in neuroimaging who insist on eyes open because they're worried that people will fall asleep. Unlikely with psychedelics, but still. But many psychedelic researchers would say that actually it's probably way more difficult to keep your eyes open and looking at a fixation, and that it might make more sense for just everyone to keep their eyes closed during a resting state scan with psychedelics. But that's still kind of under debate, but I completely agree that it would be really meaningful to do a similar data collection where we can basically, in all the conditions, the eyes are the same, so that we can almost use sober, no ayahuasca, no music as a baseline to compare with all other conditions that we're using. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm very glad that you're thinking about that, and I'm also I would like to point out that in your results that there is a significant effect of gaze, and that moving forward it might be beneficial to look into that more deeply, also in the
Absolutely.
follow-up research.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jan.
Should we take another
Yeah,
question?
thank you.
Thank you so much. Was there a question in here? Somebody would like to, but I think there's another one from Patrick online. And then, no, go on, Mario, please.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering, I mean, when the Sons of Diamond, for example, perform the rituals, I guess a very big part of the experience is that the music is collectively produced and that they are part of it. What do you think? I mean, of course, that's incredibly hard to replicate in a scanner, but what do you think would have been the differences if we had an eye into their brains? What could we see? What difference does it make that we are in this community which is producing the music, and you're part of it, not just of the musical experience, but of the
Yeah, I think you're completely right. So on the one hand, we have researchers like Dr. Leo Roseman, who's doing a lot of work on the feeling of comunitas or group collective experience within psychedelics, which is how psychedelics were taken before psychedelic therapy started for the most part. When it comes to the production of music, I think that's a very good point because even outside the psychedelic or drug space, production of music, especially by musicians or people who maybe aren't that skilled but know the music quite well, can lead to these flow states. So almost altered states of consciousness without drugs involved. So there absolutely could be a compounding effect. And as you saw in the first video, it's also like everyone's moving in the same rhythm. So you have this feeling of being part of a much larger body. I mean, I think we've all experienced it when you go to a concert and everyone is just moving the same way and you feel like you're something bigger than yourself. So don't have a numbers answer, but I think those were absolutely like completely relevant things to point to and to look at further in terms of how we want to do psychedelic therapy. Because, for example, in the States, it's very much an individual process. But I know, for example, many practitioners in Switzerland will have group-based therapies for things such as PTSD. That will be a very different experience. Yeah.
So we would love to have one of the OPM systems, one of the new mix systems that you can wear and as you're moving around. Right?
That would be great.
Wonderful. So lots of great things to do. I think there are more questions.
Yeah, just
Paul,
a follow-up on that. So
Yeah.
I grew up in a kind of Catholic school system, and people in those churches are pretty rubbish at singing, right? So you go to church and everyone sings the hymn, and lots of people are out of tune and that kind of thing. So that made me wonder whether this has some kind of link to this condition you're talking about, of familiar music that has this element of unpredictability, where if we're all producing the music together as a church, we may be unintentionally recreating this, right? Because people to my left and right may be singing a familiar piece,
but slightly out of tune.
It very, very accurately.
That's a very interesting point.
They may have this exact effect that your research describes is important.
Absolutely, that's a really interesting point. I think the nature of their music is it's quite simple. It's simple in the sense of it's repetitive, the melodies don't become too complex. So it almost has a lullaby quality, just a more dynamic lullaby.
They're probably a bit better than the average like London Catholic church as well.
But also,
maybe.
But also the level of predictability was not so much in the actual pitch, but it was in the rhythm that is produced. And of course, in a choir, most of the people stick to the rhythm. So at least that effect is not quite there.
Yes, but being as someone who's not particularly musical myself, I know how hard it is to stick to a rhythm no matter how hard you try. So who knows?
It would be interesting to know if we take the average churchgoer in this experience, so the kind of person you might be standing next to, how good a job are they doing at keeping to the pitch?
Yeah.
But the other question, of course, is how are they feeling? And one of the great things about even people who say they can't sing, once they start singing, say at the Christmas party, they still feel a great sense of communitas, even if they're slightly out of tune. And I'm not passing judgment here.
No, that's fair. My face was more so, I thought you were going to say they end up sounding good. I was like, that's
and they do, and they feel good, right? I mean, I distinctly remember this.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
So again, I think there's some interesting questions here, and of course it relates to this idea. I think we have a question there and then that way.
Okay.
I think that's how it works.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was just touching my face. But I do actually have a question. Have you looked at brain lateralization in this and dominance of the right hemisphere with music, with psychedelics, with meaning and unity and all the things that are kind of associated with that nature of? Not directly,
but I will say that, for example, when we looked at like the machine learning classifiers and what regions are most affected in terms of how far they move within the hierarchy, it did often seem to be that it was regions from one side of the brain more so than the other. I believe within the resting state condition, and then within music, it became more balanced.
But that general popular story that left and right brain doesn't hold up when you look at neuroimaging. It's very rare that you see any of this. One of the classic examples is the example of meditation, and Richard Davison, amongst others, were claiming that that really just was a right hemisphere kind of thing. Nobody's been able to replicate that. So this idea that in the normal brain that there are these visualizations apart from language doesn't seem to hold up. So that's just the general
I
observation.
just thought there was a really interesting paradox, or maybe potential paradox, and it might just be about the interpretation of it. But you have the Rubus model, which is relaxing the high-level beliefs and higher expectations of the world under psychedelics. But actually, you found that there was the greatest difference when you would get the biggest error signal because they were familiar with the music. And actually, it was when it was slightly altered. So there'd be the largest error signal in that context that the traces, or I can't remember what you're recording in that specific instance, was most different. So I was wondering whether that was an effect of actually you're decreasing the size of the error signal, so it's most different from the pre-music condition, or whether it was and maybe you can't tease this out in the data that you've got, but if it was a case where they're actually responding more to the error, that would almost be a bit paradoxical with the whole idea of relaxation of expectations.
Yes, that is that is a very interesting point. I guess that would be more so from the perspective of like how much the drug affects the hierarchy, rather than like what the baseline hierarchical framework looks like before the drug. So the second part we looked at. I'm trying to think now whether with the data that we have, we'd be able to tease this out. Probably.
I think it's a very good suggestion. And
Yeah.
as they say, nothing like a bit of data to ruin a good theory, right? So
I will have
the
a
big
look.
question is,
Thank
like
you.
Kat is saying, does it really affect the general relaxation, which is clearly well established? But then, of course, what is it that happens with those errors within that signal that you're then trying to make sense of? And does it happen at a global level, which is what Kat showed you, or what is happening at the local level? So that's a dual answer that I think we should be able to give you.
I guess a part of me intuitively would expect that if you're responding to the change in error without the drug, and then you're having a suppressed effect of that change under the influence of the drug, I'd expect to see significant differences without the drug itself between the different music conditions.
Sure. And you didn't see that?
And we didn't see that. On the whole brain measure. I haven't explored that specifically on a more local level, and that could be really interesting to do. Absolutely.
So one of the reasons why we designed the experiment this way is because of the Chaplin mask effect. So if you have a mask and you're looking at it and you see the outside of the mask and you turn it around, and suddenly what happens is that inside of the mask pops out. So you now see it like it's a real mask. Now that's a very strong effect of the prior expectations we have of the world, namely that faces can't be reversed in that way, right? Now, what people anecdotally say when they take psychedelics is that they actually see the inside of the mask. In other words, that prior driving of the error signals is going away. And one of the things we are hoping that the data set will tell us about is whether this is really true. People have tried to make that Chaplin effect with people on the psychedelics, but only one place in the world, namely Switzerland, can people do tasks when they do psychedelics. The rest of them find it quite difficult. It's a joke, of course, right? But the bottom line is it's very difficult to do tasks. But the beautiful thing about music is that you can listen to music and your brain will tell us how it is that you actually listen to that moment of predictability and non-predictability.
Yeah, it's the only one that's really a task without being a task.
Yeah. One other thing I just thought was interesting is I've been doing some single cell sequence data, kind of often similar, just looking in the mouse, looking at the distribution of the 2A receptor in the cortex. And I noticed you had quite a lot of language effects in the last slide, but you get a lot of, it's the ALM in the mouse, which is motor area, but it's also in the prefrontal cortex, it's homologous area, which includes Barocca's area and stuff.
Yeah.
So, and you find this big spike in 2A expression relative to other cortical areas there. So it could be a bias in the receptor as well that's causing that.
Yes, but we didn't see that effect for the drug.
Yeah.
We saw that for regardless of a drug, whether you're just resting or you're listening to the music.
Yeah.
And the musical stimuli itself didn't have words. So it's not that they were, but I guess some sort of language engagement, which to me would then reflect like thinking about the lyrics of the songs that you're listening to. But that's just an idea. Yeah.
One final question, and then we get chocolate, and we get coffee and Jamrock.
I have two questions, but
Just one. You can only get one.
no, I actually wanted to see the top 10 brain areas.
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry.
I just want to know if it corresponds with.
Sorry. Here we go.
I was just wondering, like, do you have any hypothesis to why certain brain areas show up in these top 10?
So not specifically, like a lot of these make sense that they would show up, but it's also difficult to say why should these show up rather than others. I think for me, so how we did this was we ranked regions based on how significantly different their location was in the two conditions, and then iteratively added them to the model based on that. So these are the top 10 regions that were most significantly affected, but a lot of other regions were significantly affected as well. So I wouldn't necessarily say, okay, it's only these 10 regions that are leading to that are being changed. It does seem to be a wider brain network that's changed. Mostly what's interesting to me here is literally only the one in bold overlaps between the two columns as being like most significantly changed between drug and no drug conditions, which is curious. I don't really know yet whether that's because of where they're starting from. So for example, with music listening, potentially certain regions just simply being more activated, like having regions related to memory, for example, and recall, or whether it's a combination of the drug effect as well. But
So
that's still to be
one of the
checked.
key differences between a resting state and a music listening paradigm is that your brain is being driven while you're listening to music. So
Yeah.
you are no longer just thinking about what you need to prepare for dinner tonight and all the terrible things that people told you and so on. So one of the key things here really is that. And of course, what we're looking at here, so it's not like with like, it's oranges with potatoes, right? And also the ayahuasca and the no ayahuasca for music listening is really what we need to think about, and not just in terms of these single regions, but how it is that they act as a network. So this in many ways is just the first draft of the kinds of things we need to see, and then I think we need to go in and understand that in a more kind of directed way. But this, of course, is all the kind of exciting things that will now, once she's done the thesis, we will come back and give you all the answers that you want. But I think it remains for me to thank Katarina for an amazing talk. Thank you all. And now for the chocolate and for the
Can I ask a clarification?
potatoes.
Of course. The regions that you just
Interesting what you
listed,
just said. I was wondering whether with the music you'd actually get a more uniform change. So it kind of locks everyone's
I mean,
brain
some of
into a
these
certain
things,
state.
especially like the amygdala, are connected to like emotional